Everyone. Welcome to my channel where we explore RC3 analysis of various topics. Today we will be exploring RC3 of money. Um, we'll start our discussion with the historical use of money. Like what are the things that have been used as money? In the prehistoric era, it started with a barter system, then various commodities were used wheat, rice, grain, gold, etc. Then in 600 BC, metal coins started appearing: gold, silver, typically bronze, copper. The works. In the period, it became bank and paper notes. 17th to 19th century, banknotes and gold standard. Then fiat currency, electronic banking, digital payments, and cryptocurrencies currently. So various things have been working as money. And Aristotle came up with four essential principles of what constitutes a good money. First of all, it's durable, which means it does not rot, rust, or decay, disappear, etc. over time. Second is it's portable, which means you can easily pick it up and take it around. Third is it's divisible. If I have one Bitcoin worth 10 units, I can chop it into 10 parts and each of them is 1 unit. And then it's intrinsically valuable, right? It must have value by itself and not be just a random piece of paper. So, question for you guys: amongst the various forms of money, which of them follow Aristotle rules, and to what extent do they follow Aristotle rules? I'll leave you to ponder about that. Moving forward, the second thing is a concept, the concept of valuation, saying, okay, I've got something which is now functioning as money, but how do I decide how much of money is anything worth? Suppose I want to buy a coconut, what should I be paying for that, right? So, various valuation concepts came in: survival usefulness, direct exchange ratios, commodity benchmarks, etc. But at the end of it, I mean, there are certain implications of coming up with a valuation model. For example, valuation will drive price. Valuation is subjective and situation specific. That's a very important point. Um, Basically, the point is if you are stranded on an island and you have not eaten for the last, let's say, 5 days, you might be having a pirate's treasure worth $1 billion, but you trade that entire treasure for a meal of food and some water to drink. So water's valuation entirely depends upon you and depends upon the situation you find yourself in. That is why the concept of a market was created to determine price, where all the so-called buyers and sellers come and then they keep, you know, sharing their random opinions of what the price should be, and then they figure out what the average is and they call that the price. Right? So that's how things are priced. In short, there is no clear basis on what the price of anything needs to be, um, and how it is defined. Right? So the price is completely an average opinion of a whole bunch of people, basically. So moving forward, is there really a scientific basis to price anything? And if there's no basis to define what the price of something is, what are the implications of that? Right? Everybody has got a different idea of what the price is supposed to be. What does that actually mean? And if there is no basis to come up with a price, what is economics really doing? Right? What is it? Is the market model really making any sense? Is the economics really making any sense? Leave it to you guys to ponder about this. Moving forward, we all know how the market model works. There's a demand and there's a supply. So as the price reduces, the demand increases. As the price increases, the supply increases. So the two meet at a so-called point, which is the ideal quantity and price for that particular product, right? But suppose I'm on a boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and I have no way to even place my order. So I'm not able to participate in the market, right? Are these criteria also considered in a market model? And therefore, does the market only work for the people who are able to participate in it and the people who are able to provide, the product to the market, right? If you're not physically able to get to the market, you're not a market participant. Is that true? I leave you guys to think about it, right? So how does the available product supply affect the market? For example, how do you supply me anything in the middle of the ocean? Now, suppose I give a super gigantic amount of money to everybody in the market. How is that going to affect the price? Which means, since the price is an opinion of the person in the market, right? Does the net worth of the person decide what the price is supposed to be. So is price really a function of net worth and not, and there's because there's no real scientific basis to define what the price is. Now, imagine I want to give this gigantic amount of money. The Fed just has to say yes and print money into their bank accounts. So it's not even, it means it's a completely random number. Right? So it's very easy to do this. And what if there are only certain buyers who are able to influence the Fed to print the money into their accounts, but others are not able to? What does that imply? Right? So how does the net worth of buyers affect the market? And is the market actually a, a trade between the buyer's cash and the supplier's product, and it's got nothing to do with demand supply, which means you are not a buyer if you are poor because you don't have enough money to participate in the market and buy food, for example, right? So that becomes a very big question. And if the reason you don't have money is because the random printing of the Fed is not coming to you, what are the implications of economic theory on this? Now let's assume that something scientific behaves like economics, right? So we take the process of measuring length. So there's this girl who's really the blue figure here, the circle and this and the rectangle, and everybody is using the same measuring stick. So everybody says, hey, the girl is 1.63 meters high. Everywhere she builds buildings, she gets into a building, the doorway is appropriately tall for her. She gets dresses that fit her everywhere. Now imagine the whole thing operated like economics, where everybody has got a different measuring stick. So even if you have the same dollar note, each of you think that the dollar note buys something different, right? You're not even able to agree on what a dollar buys. So the dollar, even if you use the same measuring stick, it's not the same measuring stick. So imagine everybody had a different stick, and they all said this is what 1 meter is. They randomly pick up a stick and say this is a meter, and then all the buildings will have completely random heights, because if one person builds a building of 1 meter, the other person builds a building of 1 meter, they're not going to match. The dresses that she gets is going to be completely random. And then in this whole equation, people who are really tall will not be able to fit into buildings because the people with the shorter measuring sticks have built very short, you know, houses. Of course, they're using lesser material. They're able to get their construction done faster, etc., etc. But the bottom line is that we will say that poor people are poor because they're not working hard, even though it's completely a fault of the system. So the economic theory is what's causing poverty. It's not that people working hard or not working hard is causing poverty. Yeah. So let's explore that idea a little bit more. How do the rich people really get rich? There was a transaction between the central bank and the bank where a random number was randomly agreed upon, and that was given as a so-called loan with an interest rate attached to it. The interest rate also being completely random because there's no basis for anything without a scientific basis for valuation. If 20 people cannot agree on the same number, then the number is random, right? Because it's probably come up with the market. Then banks give loans to companies, again completely a random transaction with a random value and a random interest. And the company agrees on a salary, a completely random number salary to the CEO and a completely random number salary to the worker at the bottom. The worker at the bottom does all the work, but he gets a random number, and the CEO gets a completely random number, and there's a random logic which sort of tells why anybody is getting any number. Right? So is the net worth a consequence of randomly valued transactions, or is there actually a basis for the net worth of anybody? I'll leave you to think about it and provide your answer in the comments below. And does net worth really depend upon the ability to fraud the banks, right? So Elon Musk, for example, might come and say, "Hey, if you work hard, you'll get a huge random number like me," and he'll quote whatever his net worth is. Now, what is the basis for his net worth, right? How do you actually justify the valuation without a scientific basis for it? So, and imagine every buyer is participating with a random number net worth in a market. Then, suppose I say, hey, I want to be extremely rich. So I make a random transaction with my neighbor and say, next time I cut my toenail, you pay me $7 billion trillion for it. And he agrees, right? He doesn't have the money, but that's his problem. Once he gives me an IOU for 7 billion trillion, I say, hey, that's accrued revenue, and then I start behaving as if I have 7 billion trillion. Now, what's to stop me from doing that, right? And isn't this how United States is working today? The so-called, 30 billion or 30 odd billion dollar of federal debt and 200 odd billion dollars of entire US debt is basically borrowed money from their kids who have not even been born yet. So, why can't I borrow money from my neighbor if, US American citizens can do this? And then the third thing to bring about the randomness of price in a market is, imagine I go to a Tesla dealership and I offer $2 for a Tesla car. Now imagine something really crazy. The dealership agrees and they actually give me a Tesla for $2. Now that becomes the price of a Tesla. This is exactly how random the current Tesla price is, right? I mean, they just come up with a random number and say, hey, this is going to be the price. And if some buyer buys it, that becomes the price, right? Just, if I flip it around and say, hey, the buyer comes and offers $2 for a Tesla, why shouldn't the dealership agree to, you know, the price is fixed, right? So moving forward, the biggest consequence of economic theory, market model, whatever we do, and the random pricing is poverty. Now imagine there is a random distribution of random numbers, and some people just don't get the random numbers. That's what we're calling poverty. Because if I just print $1 million and give it to everybody who's poor, then all the people will basically there won't be any poor people. And wealth is created by being in the path of random number flow, right? The bank gives the money to the, I mean, central bank gives the money to the bank gives the money to the company, and the company gives the money to you. So if you're somewhere along this path, you get a gigantic random number, otherwise you don't. And then you end up in poverty because the random number distribution didn't come to you. Right? And then is poverty caused by faulty distribution of money, which is random numbers, or is there really something that poor people are not doing right, or is there really something that poor people can do in order to get out of poverty? That's basically the question that I'm posing to you guys. Let me know what you think in the comments below, of course. Now, I read this particular case about a pharma CEO. He became the CEO. He first of all chucked out the entire R&D spend, so immediately 40% extra money on his balance sheet, and then he took all the majorly popular drugs and he raised the prices of those astronomically. So imagine you're taking a particular drug for cancer. Till today, you've been paying, let's say, $5.50 or $10 for it, and suddenly the price has become $250. Now your wife is dying, so you've got no choice. You've got to pay the $250, and the pharma company makes an enormous amount of money. Now, without a basis for valuation, it's possible to set a random number as the price. Is that what happened in this case, right? That's the question I'm posing to you guys. So, is there such a thing as legal fraud? I mean, just because it survives in the court, does that mean I can commit a fraud and we call it legal fraud? Is there even a concept like that? Should there be? And if I mean, is the court going to decide what is a fraud and what is not? Is it the constitution that decides what is fraud and what is not? How do we decide it? Right. So that's essentially the question I'm posing here. And is the random distribution of random numbers a fraud or not? I don't know. Right. I'll leave it to you guys to figure it out. And just look at the number of times people are doing financialization, because it's all about the random numbers now. It's not about am I serving society, it's not about am I creating a great product, it's not about are we making progress. It's just about how can I collect more random numbers of money, right? It's all about the so-called currency. And then imagine a random distribution of random numbers because there's no ability to price. Imagine what is the implication of interest and taxes in a distribution like this. I'll leave you guys to figure it out. So, do interest and taxes really make sense without the ability to define a price, right? And how do you actually decide an interest rate? Right? How do you decide a time value of money? I don't know. I'll leave it to you guys to think about this and comment. Yeah? So, is there a concept called theory of opinion management which we should invent? Right? How do we manage such a random distribution of random numbers? So, first of all, everyone has got an opinion because having an opinion is absolutely free, right? I'm posting my opinion using a concept called RC3 on money because it's free for me. So, does this, how do we balance the opinions of 8.5 billion people on the planet, right? Should there be even a theory for this? Just a hypothesis. Now, in a contest of opinions, the winner is either the senior-most person, the boss, the loudest person, whoever shouts down everybody else and irritates them to keep, into silence, or the most numerous. Now, let's get 20,000 people and beat up whoever doesn't agree with us, right? So, this is how opinion contests are won. Nobody cares about what's right, right? I mean, there's not going to be a logical contest or, intelligence or a reasoning contest. It's just going to be a yelling contest, basically, the fish market theory, right? How can algorithms or any sort of analytic structure, anything that the Fed uses, justify a random distribution of random numbers and an opinion contest like the market model, right? How can you actually manage something like that using analytics or logic, right? Does that even make sense? And then market model is an opinion context, and is it therefore a fraud or not, right? It's more of a question of, is it a fraud? And imagine you get a Nobel Prize for this. What does that Nobel Prize even mean, right? What does it stand for? So basically, the question is there a need to invent a theory of opinion management and apply that theory to the economic model and see what does economics actually mean, right? And there are several cases where we got, situations like this. For example, economics, politics, boardrooms, there's so many other places where this kind of opinions work together to manage things. um, this kind of a theory, once it's framed up, can be used to manage these kind of random distributions, right? So just a concept. Then there is this notion of an illogic. It is one of the most interesting notions I've stumbled upon when I used RC3. And the concept is something like this, right? Um, Illogic is when you create a completely logical construct, right? You use perfect logical thinking and rules, and you come up with this gigantic construct. So everything is completely making sense as long as you're inside the framework. The moment you step outside the framework and look at the entire construct as a whole, now the whole construct does not make any sense because it's completely illogical, right? So the question is there a concept called an illogic where a logically constructed construct is completely senseless, right? So that's a question. You will not realize it if you're inside. You will have to completely come out of the whole thing and take a look at the whole thing and then see does it make sense, right? And RC3 in a way does that. So some examples of obvious illogics are democracy, elections, economics, politics, leadership. There are so many questions you can raise about any of these systems when you step back and take a look at the whole thing, right? But within it, there are reasons why it works to some extent. But what are the parts that do not work, and where does it fail, right? So these are some obvious questions about illogics. Some not so obvious illogics, in my opinion, are science, mathematics, and logical constructs. You can look at some of the other RC3 videos that I've put together. It appears that logic is not illogic, but once you create a logical construct, which means you limit the application of logic within a certain boundary. That limitation causes the entire thing to become an illogic. I don't know if that's true or not, or if it's provable or not. For example, maybe something like Gödel's theorem might be a pointer in this direction because that's where you get the whole in maths from. But I'll leave it you guys to think about it. Okay. And certain things do not seem to be illogics, things like process model system theory, things which are real, right? Operating systems, scientific rules, right? Gravity is not an illogic for obvious reasons, and so on. So, do you agree that there is a concept called an illogic, right? Let's call it illogic theory. And what are the examples of illogic, and how do you decide what is an illogic and what is not an illogic, right? So that becomes a question. And then, so what do we do next, right? If economics is in illogic, one thing is why we cannot drop money, because if we drop money, we'll start getting great mass murderers, Alexander, Napoleon, Hitler, etc. Some examples, but basically the problem is the only way to get stuff is to kill the other guy and take it, right? And we don't want to go back to that. Instead, we need to put in certain guardrails against unfair randomness, right? Let's assume that, let's accept that there's a certain amount of randomness in the distribution of money. So there must be an additional responsibility put on the Federal Reserve that if people do not have money to buy, it's the Fed's responsibility to give it to them. Basically, Fed should own the responsibility of the distribution reaching everyone, right? And because poverty is not about the stuff, poverty is about everybody receiving the money to buy the stuff. Right? That's what the market model is. And then, do we want to put some crazy rules in and say, nobody should have more than 10 million? Everything over that should be taken and distributed to the poor people. Does that even make sense? Right? This is just an example. I'm certainly not suggesting it, but what are the kind of constraints we need to put to prevent excessive accumulation of money at the same time prevent poverty? So basic question: how would you fix the economic system and the economic theory to first of all avoid poverty, right? Let's make sure that everybody at least has basic food, clothing, and shelter to eat. That's I don't think anybody has a problem with that. So fundamental problem, valuation and therefore pricing. If we don't have any accurate basis for valuation, how do we decide the basis for any price, right? There's no basis to say what the price of anything should be. Therefore, all pricing transactions, including MRPs, taxes, everything becomes a random number. These are the questions that we talked about in this video. I'm just posing all of them again. Think about them, post them in the comments. And as usual, right, if any of you want to talk to me or, uh, join a course, you can let me know.